Hey everybody, this is Andrea Paulton, your marketing guide to grow your business. Today, we have a super cool guest for you. This is the very first time I have a guest that's going to talk on this subject. And his name is Matt Johnson, and he's the host of the Microfamous podcast and the founder of Pursuing Results. He's a podcast expert. He's an agency founder. He's a marketer. Somewhere I read he's a musician, and he just became an author. So, hi, Matt. Can you tell us more about yourself, who you are, and exactly what you do?
Yes. And first of all, thanks, by the way. That was an amazing introduction, and I'm super excited to be here. I think this is going to be a really fun, fast-moving conversation. We got a bunch of stuff to get into that I think is going to be super helpful. So the quick story is right now I run an agency that does really one thing. We sell one thing to one type of person, and that's for the business coach, consultant, kind of thought leadery person. We launch and produce podcasts for them. And so that's been really amazing, just focusing on that one service for the one type of person. And so I essentially run the agency in about a half a day a week. The rest of the time I do things that I want to do, like hosting the podcast, working on the book that you mentioned, which has taken me way too long, as it does for most people.
I hear
that. and doing other fun stuff in the business world, like being interviewed on podcasts and things like that. So but 5 years ago, I was just some dude working at somebody else's marketing agency and stumbled into a position where I got put onto running live webinars with thought leaders in the real estate space. And one of those guys pitched me on the idea of starting a podcast together. And so we did. We had no business plan behind it. All we knew is that we liked each other and had good on-screen chemistry, and we knew it'd be fun. So we started it with really no other plan in mind than just he had a vague idea about wanting to coach, and I had a vague idea about wanting to do educational programs or training of some kind. And that was, I think, 4.5 years ago. And now that podcast was named like one of the top 5 in the space and has like 1.5 million downloads or something like that.
Awesome.
So it's been,
Are you
it's been
still running that podcast?
Still running that. That's called Real Estate Uncensored.
I did not know that.
Yep. So I co-host that one. I'm still on that show every week or so. My co-host has taken more of the lead on that as I've moved into the whole like Microfamous thing as the agency has taken off. But yeah, that was my background, was in kind of the real estate side, and got introduced to a lot of the initial clients from my agency through those same relationships.
Awesome. So I've been binge listening to Microfamous. So why did you start that when you were already doing a good job with the other real estate podcast?
Well, because I think like if you're the person that wants to teach and train and lead people, I think you inevitably come to this point where no matter what you're doing, whether it's getting featured on other people's podcasts or maybe sending out emails, writing blog posts or whatever, like you have that scratch or that urge, I guess, to teach and train in a way where you can actually sit down and record and speak to people and deliver like a message. And that's what it was for me. And I also wanted to have conversations with people that didn't have anything to say into the real estate market. They're more of the agency founders. They're the business coaches, the consultants. What I realized it took me about 3 years into the business to realize that real estate wasn't my niche. It was the coaches in the space that I liked so much. And then I realized why I liked them so much is it's the fact that I wanted to work with people who are driven to teach and train. Right. So once I zeroed in on that, I realized it wasn't about real estate. It was about the coaches and consultants. And that helped a lot. I think that's a journey that everybody goes through, hopefully, and comes out the other side with a firm idea of who they want to work with.
Oh yeah, totally. So when you first started the real estate one, you said you had no business plan. So what was different when you launched your second podcast and now you've been doing it, you understand more about podcasting? How did you approach it differently?
Well, through that experience, I had an interesting, I could literally compare apples to apples, which was the podcast that I was co-hosting that had a mainstream audience versus a podcast that I launched and co-hosted for quite a while with another client of mine, which ended up producing directly a multi-six-figure coaching consulting business. And at one time I was a partner in that. So I was able to hold them up and compare them apples to apples. The one with the mainstream larger audience with all the downloads got all the acclaim and all the attention and produced not very many sales, especially not from high-level affluent people in the space. The podcast that was aimed directly at them, that went super deep on content that most people can't hang with, created that multi-six-figure coaching consulting business and got the attention of the absolute top of the market, the most valuable slice of the market in that space. They all gravitated and ran like a little crowd to that podcast because it was so deep and detailed in the content that they provided. It was exactly the right thing for the right people. And so I looked at that and just said, okay, well, I'm not going to just go after the masses when I launch my own podcast. I'm going to skip the many and go straight to the few. I'm going to go and I'm going to create a podcast right for the exact person that I wanted to work with. And so that was the main lesson that I took away from the experience.
Yeah. And I teach that a lot about niching. I do have a little bit different approach where it's not just you niche by industry, but you also can niche by your transformational message. So if your message is really, really niche down, then you can go after more people. If you have a little bit of a broader message or not so defined one, then you really need to niche down and just go after only window washers or whatever your niche may be and really tighten it up. I love that idea, that the way that you're doing that. Tell us, who is your niche? Who are the listeners that go to Microfamous?
So typically it's business coaches, consultants, agency owners, and then speakers and authors, which I would consider, like you talk about kind of figuring out what your niche is. And the one thing that a lot of different people in different industries have in common. So to me, the person that typically is drawn to me is someone that's built a successful 6 or 7 figure business. It's probably not their end all be all. They're not getting a lot of significance and impact from it. Maybe they're running a 7-figure real estate business and it's good, but they also want to teach and train people because that's where they get kind of the sense of impact and legacy and fulfillment. So most of the time, those are the people that come to me and they get into my world because they're looking to, like typically they get a taste of what that feels like by training a little bit part-time behind the scenes, or they'll get interviewed on a podcast and they share their story and people reach out and thank them for sharing their story, stuff like that. And then they start to think, I'd like to do a little bit more of this and a little bit less of herding cats in my regular day-to-day business. So those are the people that tend to be listening and the ones that end up, like, we help them launch podcasts.
Yeah. So I read on your website that you have a program called the Podcast Pitch Assistant. So what does that do?
So to me, that's the first step in the process. So I was having a lot of people come to me that were interested in podcasting, didn't know a ton about it, and they weren't yet getting featured on podcasts. And to me, that's actually the lowest hanging fruit. So before you look at launching your own show, which is a pretty good commitment, which with a service like mine, it does cut down like all the tech stuff, but you still got to show up and record the episodes. Like, we can't do that for you. So before you go launching a show, and I did this backwards, believe me, but the people that I've known that went out and got interviewed first, it really helped them in a couple of ways. It clarified their message. It helped them build an audience of people that were ready and waiting for them to launch a podcast when they did, right? And they got better presenting their own content through the process of being interviewed. So it solves a lot of problems. So the people that I would have come to me that were the most ready to launch a podcast were the ones who had already been getting featured on podcasts. And the flip side of that is that when they did launch a show, they already had people who knew who they were, who were anxiously waiting and all, in some cases asking them, look, dude, when are you going to launch a podcast? I want to hear from you. I don't want to hear you just interviewed. I want to hear what you have to say. And so that's why I created this program. And I wanted to get on more interviews myself, but I knew that I was not going to do it. I found out by experience that I wasn't going to pitch myself, consistently. It just was not going to happen. So I created a training program so that you can have an assistant or a virtual assistant in the Philippines do it for you. Yeah.
So now I'm one of those people that did not start the right way, where I did not get featured on other podcasts first. I started my podcast really when nobody knew me. So I did it the wrong way. Would I still be a good candidate for the podcast pitch assistant, or is that like, okay, you already like screwed up, you're already too far gone?
You skedaddled past the stage. No, because what I found myself telling clients who were asking me, like, hey, what's the next step? How do I keep growing the podcast? And I've looked at everything and I've tried everything. The thing that was the most effective was getting interviewed on other podcasts, because those are the people that they already know how to download and subscribe to a show. Listening to podcasts is already one of their habits. And podcasts, the listeners tend to kind of self-select an audience of people who are already more interested in personal development or business development than the average person. Yeah. So if if you already have a podcast, the best way to grow it is to get featured on other podcasts. So it's not, like you can skip to starting your own show first, just like I did back in the day. It was like 3 years before I got featured on anybody else's podcast with any sign, like kind of regularity. So
Yeah.
I did it backwards too, and it ended up just fine.
Okay, cool. So there's hope for me.
Yeah.
So give us some tips without giving away, of course, the entire program, but give us some like high level tips. So how do I go on other people's podcasts? So funny enough, right before I started interviewing you, I came off a call from James Wedmore. He runs Business by Design in a group called Next Level, and I'm in that group. And we're just talking about podcasting. And one of the other students in the class, she just got Gary Vaynerchuk, or she got on. No, she interviewed Gary Vaynerchuk on her show, and now she wants to go on his show. So we're talking about like tips on how to do that. One of her tips was, instead of just sending like, your Joe Schmo email, the regular email that every single person pitches with, do a video of yourself and be like, hey, this is what I do. This is who I am. I'd love to be on your show. This is what I can provide. So is that something that you recommend, videos or not? Because in one way, are people going to take their time to watch the videos, or is that a good thing to introduce yourself?
I think if you're talking to someone who is a couple of rungs below the Gary V's of the world, who check their own phone, I think that could work. What works with the Gary V's of the world is two things: mutual relationships and timing. So if you want to get a really big guest on your show, the best way to do it is by getting an introduction from somebody that they already know and trust, because they're like Gary V and people like him are isolated and have people around them whose entire job is to screen the rest of the world away from them. And rightfully so. They're super busy. That's fine. I have my email screened by my assistant too. So I'm in that crowd. If you send me an email about getting onto my podcast and it has a video in it, it's not even me that would watch it. It'd be my assistant. So maybe it would resonate with them. So if you shot me a quick email and said, hey, James Wedmore recommended that I reach out because he thought I'd be a good guest for your podcast, I'm going to read the rest of that email. Right? Yeah. Or anybody else that I have a good relationship with. So the cool thing about getting into the world of podcasting is the more that you get featured as a guest, and then let's say you start your own show and then you have the ability to invite people, you start to build up this snowball of relationships where you know more and more people. And you didn't just shake their hand at an event for 5 minutes and they forgot about you. You get to have a conversation like what you and I are having, where we're spending a half hour, 40 minutes looking each other in the eye and getting a really good sense of what the other person is like. And so you become way more memorable than if you meet people at events. Like you did an episode about like the new school of networking. And I completely agree. The guy I used to work for had to grow the agency by flying all over God's creation to every event and trying to catch people in between sessions. It's way better to meet them through podcasting. So if you do that, and then you can leverage those connections to get introductions to the people that you want to meet. Because I also know somebody who had Gary V as the very first episode of her podcast. The reason it happened was because her husband worked for a sports show, and the sports show booked Gary V on the TV show, and then her husband made the introduction to her. So it was 100% pure relationship, and you'd be shocked at how much that's how those big guest spots land. So that's number one. And then number two is timing. So we booked Grant Cardone on one of our clients' podcasts last year. I have no relationship with Grant Cardone, right? Super busy, insanely busy. That guy's not checking his own email. So no matter how amazing of a pitch email I send it's not getting to him. So how do we book him? Because it was at the time, our client is big in the real estate investing space and very well respected and connected. Grant Cardone's staff knows that at this point in his life, he's looking to make connections with people in the real estate investing space because that's the entire thrust of his business right now. It was pure timing. We reached out at the right time. He said, yep, I've got a time slot next week. Let's do it. Get in the calendar. Otherwise it's gone. We're like, we'll take it.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So the next thing you know, Grant Cardone is on one of our shows, which is fine, but you can't predict that. So even like the Gary V's and Seth Godins of the world, if you want to get them on your show, you just got to keep hammering away. And the next time they have a book to promote, they're probably going to say yes to almost every podcast that invites them on.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. So, okay, so that's how you can, or a couple of tips on how to get people on your show. How do
Hmm.
you get on their shows? Maybe let's not talk about the Gary V's and the Cardones.
Right.
Let's talk about normal level people. How do you get on people's shows?
Well, yeah, and just a quick word on why wouldn't you want to go after the Gary V's of the world? I would say you're probably not, unless you've been on 50 shows already, you're probably not ready to be on Gary V's podcast, right?
I
You're
know. Could you imagine you're just totally flubbing? What's your name? I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember.
and maybe, and I'm sure it wouldn't be that bad, but your messaging isn't going to be as precise. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying? Because you haven't gone through the process of engaging with the audience to see what they respond to over and over and over again. So you
Mhm.
believe me, you want 50 podcasts under your belt before you show up and get interviewed by Gary Vee. So you want those smaller shows, and you want those smaller shows that have really active, smaller communities of people that all have, like, they're all rallying around a smaller idea, right? Because then
Mhm.
you can show up and you can really tailor what you're saying to that smaller community and say something that really resonates with them. And if you get the right podcast at the right community, it can explode. One of my clients was on Pat Flynn's podcast, and this was like 3 years ago, and she can tie 100 grand in revenue
Oh
to
my
that
God.
one podcast interview because it was
That's
the right podcast.
insanity.
So when you talk about like getting yourself booked onto a show like that, again, it goes back to mutual relationships most of the time. So what you're looking for is a connection to them. So you reach out to your network first and say, hey, I want to get on so and so's podcast. I want to get on Pat Flynn's podcast. Who knows somebody that's close to Pat? And somebody's going to come back to you and say, well, hey, I was on Azul's podcast, I think it's Born to Lead, Born to Write, Born to Write. So Azul is the one that handled the editing on Pat's last book.
Oh
Azul runs a
wow.
podcast. Well, go pitch yourself. Don't go pitch yourself to Pat. Go pitch yourself to Azul and get on his podcast first. And
Yeah.
if it's good, ask Azul for an introduction to Pat Flynn. Right. So like go after, if you just like, it's the Kevin Bacon approach
Yeah.
to getting on podcasts. So if you do that, like that makes it way easier, and you don't have to twist yourself into a pretzel trying to find the perfect email or the perfect time to send the email to get their attention. You get their attention by going in through a relationship that they already trust.
And then once you have that relationship and you ask for an introduction, they're the ones. The introduction is emailing, or are you emailing and saying, "Hey, I got your email from my friend, you know, Grant
You
Cardone."
can do either, but
Yeah.
the other person sending the introduction is way more powerful. You can get by name dropping if you have
Okay.
to, but yeah, getting the other person to introduce you is more powerful.
Okay. So now, Andrea, me 2 years ago,
Hmm.
I wouldn't have known anybody. I didn't have a network in this space. I came from corporate marketing, only knew other corporate marketers. I never even listened to a podcast. How does that person get on anybody's show? If you don't even
Well,
have a network, like how do you even get out there so people might want to maybe interview you? Or is
I
that,
would say if you're
or is it
going
just,
in, no, like you can do it. You can absolutely do it. I would start with the smaller shows first. Those are easy. Those are going to be available sooner anyway. And a lot of times those are just people that are like the podcast may be new, but that doesn't mean the person's a small fry. So if you reach out to a smaller podcast, so if you go into iTunes and you say, okay, I want to get interviewed by podcasts in the financial advice space, the wealth management space. So you go into iTunes and look for the podcasts that kind of hit that market. Look for the podcasts that have fewer than 25 reviews on iTunes. Those are either going to be smaller shows with smaller audiences or relatively new shows that just don't have a lot of reviews yet. It could be either one. They could be hosted by big players where the podcast is new, or they could be smaller players who have really good content but not a huge following yet. They could also be very well connected. You never know. So if you start there, those podcasts that are smaller and newer are going to be more likely to say yes anyway, as long as you have good content to share.
yeah,
And whether they believe that and agree with you that you have good content just comes down to the email that you send them, where you tell them, hey, this is why I think it'd be a good fit, and this is what I would share. And if they
yeah,
read that email and go, yeah, I agree, my audience would like to hear from that, most likely you're going to get booked.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I love it. Um, you had mentioned, I don't know if I don't remember where I saw this. Could have been your website, might not have been one of your podcasts, but you started talking about like clear and compelling ideas. And I'm quoting
Mm.
you, clear and compelling ideas on how to break through the noise.
Yeah.
So I'm a marketing podcast, right? There's a lot of us out there. There's a lot of business coaches out there. And for me, I'm just testing subjects and then I see what works and what doesn't. This is actually one of the first times the entire episode is geared towards podcasting. So this is a great test for me. So I was really excited to be able to speak with you today. So that's how I do it, just to kind of see like what's working, what's not. And then I just whatever subjects people like, I end up talking more and more about that. So what are some other ways to get out there? So not interviewing people, not being interviewed, like how else can you break through the noise?
Well, the clear and compelling idea, to me, is the secret behind everything. And I'll relate it to podcasting real quick. So when you break down the numbers of why do podcasts grow, and you look at how are people finding out about new podcasts? 65% of it is word of mouth. So 2/3 of it is not any sort of growth hackery that we can control. You know what I'm saying? Believe me, I've had clients that twisted themselves into every which way, trying to find some way to game the system and top the charts and yada, yada. From my perspective, it didn't make a difference. Their show grew organically and it kept growing organically while they were trying all this stuff. The reason it grew organically is because people enjoyed their show and they were giving people a reason to tell their friends about it. That's the best reason for a podcast to grow. That's also the best reason for any business to grow. Seth Godin talks about that a lot. Like if you can't get people to talk about your product or service, go back to the drawing board and improve the product or service and tell other people talk about it, because up until then, you're trying to get the word out on something that people just aren't that interested in. And that's going to be a hard road. So I think the most important thing is to get really the entire idea of your podcast, or if we're talking about your business in general, is to get the idea right. Make sure it's really clear, but most of all, it has to be compelling. And when I say compelling, it means it has to compel action. So one of the things that I noticed in the early days when I was talking to people, so I would reach out, for example, on LinkedIn. And I would basically like say, hey, I noticed that we're connected through so-and-so. I've got a podcast that I think you might be a good fit for. If you want some details, we can jump on a quick chat. Super, super easy. People were really receptive. I booked a whole bunch of 15-minute calls and got to know a bunch of people. Inevitably, somewhere at that point in the conversation, they'd ask, well, what do you do? Oh, well, I produce podcasts. We launch and produce podcasts. It's like a complete done-for-you service for coaches and consultants and speakers. And they're like, wait a minute, you do everything? I'm like, yeah. Okay, we have to talk after this, right? So that like the response that I got, it didn't just roll off their back, and I didn't just get like a nice pat of encouragement and sent on my way. It was, holy cow, I didn't know that existed. We need to have a conversation. And the clients that I know that have the easiest time of growing their business and growing their podcast all get that same response from their ideal clients. Now, not everybody, but the ideal clients. And so the people that I love to work with are the ones that have figured out, they've built their business around a clear and compelling idea that speaks really, really deeply to a small, valuable slice of the market. And then when those people hear that idea, they cannot unhear it. They can't go back. Like, it breaks their world. I'll give you another example. One of my very first clients runs a real estate team. It was the number one team of Berkshire Hathaway before he just moved over to KW. And so he lost that distinction, but still one of the biggest teams in the country. He nets $1 million a year off of a team that he runs in about 2 hours a week.
Oh, wow.
Now, once a real estate agent who is working 70 or 80 hours a week hears that, they either, like, it breaks their world. They cannot, they can't go back. Right? They can't go back to saying, well, this is just the way real estate is. So like, not according to this guy over here. Yeah. So let's figure out what he's doing. So he has an idea that literally all people have to do is they hear it once and it breaks their worldview. And they cannot go back to the way things were. So now the question is, okay, A, is it believable? Which in some cases it might not be, because it was so fantastically out of this world. But once they heard him interviewed on a podcast, they got it. Like, oh, okay, I get it. There's a model for this. Like, exactly. And by the way, you can pay $3,000 to show up at his office in Omaha and learn the model. Really? Sign me up. And we had people just going to the website and signing up and showing up on a plane and getting on a plane and going to Omaha for an event. So that's the power of getting the idea right.
Awesome. Oh, I love that. I just love that. All right. So I'm going to move away from podcasting. I want to know more about you, and I'm totally going to put you on the spot. So get ready. Okay. So you're a good looking dude. Why podcasting and not becoming a YouTube star or just doing more with video?
Well, first of all, I love video, and thank you for the compliment, by the way. So when I first got started, I was in live webinars on Google Hangouts when that was a thing. So my start was in live video. So I am biased. I love live video. I still go live on Facebook 2, 3, 4 times a week. It's great. Podcasting, nobody's watching a video for a podcast. Right. They'll watch a clip. So we do clips and things like that. But in terms of like in order for somebody to spend 30, 40 minutes with you in their ear, it has to be audio. So no matter how much of a YouTube star or potential you might have, there's so much value in a podcast because you can get into somebody's ear and they're listening to you for 30 or 40 minutes at a stretch. They'll never sit down and watch your YouTube video that long. But YouTube's been very good for me. We have like 15,000 subscribers for our real estate podcast on YouTube. And a lot of our early growth was like at one point, 2/3 of our entire listing audience was on YouTube. I mean, it worked out great for us. But unless you have, like that was when we were streaming live to YouTube, and YouTube put a lot of support behind that once. So we took advantage and we rode the wave for a while. And then when Facebook Live came along, we switched over and we rode that wave for a little bit. And now we're shifting back to refocus on YouTube. So I think everything has its place. But for thought leaders and coaches and consultants, to me, like you mentioned the way that you run video with your podcast, that's exactly the same thing I do. The video is for your website so people get to know you and build a relationship with you. And then the podcast is where they listen to the audio. That's exactly the same thing we do for our clients, because I think that's the recipe that works.
Yeah. All right. You said you were on YouTube, shifted to Facebook Live, switched back to YouTube. Why did you switch back? Why did you not stay on Facebook Lives?
So Facebook Live, I've noticed the reach going down, the reach and the engagement. So at one point we had it rigged up to where we built relationships with about 25 other Facebook groups. So our reach was like 100,000 people on Facebook.
Awesome.
And so we would go live on Facebook. And then when you watch the notifications roll in, when we went live, there would be 20 notifications from every single group. So if you were in all those groups, you saw the notifications that we were going live just stream across your notification bar. Well, came a time when Facebook stopped all that. So you only got one notification. Then you stopped getting a notification, right? And even that was dicey. So Facebook just like, there was a time when they pushed Facebook Live a lot, and then they start and they move on to something else. And I think the lesson there for all of us is that is the cycle. That happens every time. For a while, it'll be IGTV. And then, then TikTok will get big, whatever it is. Like there's always going to be that initial crest. And if you ride that wave, you can get a lot of subscribers, maybe even for free. The question is, what do you do with them? And when that wave stops, are you going to move on to the next thing? Or are you going to find something that's more permanent? And to me, podcasting is like my safe harbor. I can dink around with other stuff like Facebook groups and whatever's the hot thing at the moment. Yeah. But I always want to lead people back to a permanent asset where I have their permission to keep in touch. So podcast, I want them in my email list. That's the safe harbor.
Yeah, that's my safe harbor too. I don't know why the YouTube thing, I get started and then I stop. I know I'm not going to do it. So the podcast it's easy for me. I like to do it. I like to talk. So that helps. And I like to interview people like you where I get to like learn new things along with my listeners. So riding waves, what about LinkedIn Live since that got launched? What do you think about that?
I honestly have not tinkered with it at all. I actually forgot that it existed, which doesn't say a lot for LinkedIn Live.
Doesn't it? I know. Actually, a lot of people don't know about it. I met with a bunch of business owners last night, and I would say like maybe, I don't know, 3 out of 50 knew about it.
Yeah,
they didn't do a
LinkedIn
good job
is interesting.
It.
Well, because part of the reason why I love LinkedIn is people aren't on it enough to where people have figured it out how to game it, if that makes sense. So right now, people's LinkedIn inboxes are still relatively uncluttered, although that's changing because there's a lot of services and VAs out there that'll message people for you, which is unfortunate because it's going to decrease the effectiveness. But yeah, LinkedIn, like even in the business world, people will pull up Facebook once an hour and just scroll. Like I've noticed that when I do Facebook Lives, like even really busy, successful people, I'm shocked that they dive into my Facebook Live for a minute here, a minute there, comment, and then they'll duck out. That's a super valuable touch for me. And usually I'm using it to promote my podcast. So people are like, I'm doing it for a purpose. LinkedIn, I feel like more people are still using it on the desktop. They're not absent-mindedly scrolling every single hour on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
That's part of one of the reasons why messaging still works on LinkedIn, whereas messaging on Facebook, crapshoot. So
Yeah.
like everything has its advantage, but I haven't seen a lot with LinkedIn Live that makes me want to go run over there and start going live every day.
Yeah. Okay. Second, putting you on the spot question. So you have two businesses essentially, right? You have where you're teaching and where you're training, and then you have where you're actually doing the work, you're doing the consulting. Which makes more money and what do you like better?
The done for you service definitely is my bread and butter. Podcast Pitch Assistant came along towards the end of 2018, something like that. And that has the potential to be a 7-figure course a year. And I obviously would love to get it to that point, but it's not my primary business. For me, it started off as a way to, number one, systematize a process for me internally. Number two, then monetize that and like add an extra benefit to my clients, because they were asking for a service that I didn't want to build into our core service. I didn't want to get unfocused. So like me creating that program solved that problem. So I didn't get pulled into doing something I didn't want to offer in my core service. And then the opportunity to monetize it beyond that is just, for me, it's like gravy. So it brings in, an extra, let's say 5 figures a year to 6 figures or something like that. I'd be good with that. If it brings in $1 million over the next 10 years, I'm good with that, because the breadwinner is my one sole focus, which is the agency.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. So tell me about the book. So it's called Microfamous, like your podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first, I want to know what the book's all about, but I also want to hear about the horror stories about writing the book in the first place.
Okay. Okay. So briefly, the subtitle of the book is How to Become Famously Influential to the Right People. Because I think one of the biggest issues that I run up against is people are full of enthusiasm and they immediately ask, how can I build a podcast that gets 1 million downloads? And I'm like, been there, done that. It's a frustrating road in a lot of ways, right? And you can't control whether it takes off and gets popular. What you can control is building an audience that 5,000 affluent, valuable, ideal clients are looking for right now and can't find. So somewhere out there, if you're any kind of coach or consultant, there's a few thousand people that you'd love to work with, that they're probably looking for a podcast out there. They're looking for content and they're not finding it in the stuff that's out there already. Find where the gap is and let's build a podcast for them. Well, then what do you do with all the objections that come up with that? Like, well, I don't want to be trapped in a niche. I don't want to confine myself. I don't want to be that specialty. I don't want to niche down that far, yada, yada, yada. So the book basically lays out like, hey, look, here is the strategy for exactly how to use podcasting and new media to become micro famous to exactly the right people, to where you have that home base. And then you can decide, okay, now I own this smaller niche. I'm going to go into another niche, but I'm going to do it intelligently and I'm going to do it strategically. I'm not going to try to run before I walk. And to me, that's the best analogy for it, is a lot of times we're trying to run before we can walk. So this book is about how you get there. How do you establish that first status of being micro famous to exactly the right people that should hire you? And then once you have that home base established, then all of your options open up to where you can go bigger if you want to. So think of like Gary Vee with Wine Library TV. If Gary Vee tried to be Gary Vee without doing Wine Library TV first, who of us would have believed him that he was a social media expert?
Yeah.
Like, no, it's like, okay, great. Okay, that's fine. The Wine Library TV was his Microfamous.
Yeah.
It was his first entrance into the market, is where he proved that he knew what he was talking about. Then he was able to jump up and speak to all entrepreneurs about social media. Right.
Yeah.
So that's what the book is about. All right. So the horror stories, it took me 6 months longer to write it than I thought.
So what was the total length?
I started writing it in March of this year. We're recording in January of 2020. So by the time the book comes out, it'll be almost a year from start to finish. What's funny is that 2018, I wrote 30,000 words to a book in a month. And I'm like, okay, great. I wrote the wrong book. Back to the drawing board. I kid you not. I wrote the wrong book. So I thought the same thing. I'll just March of this year, I'm going to crank it out. It's going to be 30 days. It'll be awesome. It'll be launched by June. Come June, still working on the ideas for the main part. it just kept dragging on because I had to get clarity on my own thinking. And that's what did it. So I just had to work the process. I should have just planned on it being a year, and I would have had a lot fewer sleepless nights.
Yeah. So you strike me as someone that totally experiments, does new things, always like bigger and better. So what's next? So you're an author, you're a musician, you have an agency, you have a podcast. What's next for you?
So the model is, the model for the agency is to keep taking on about 2 clients a month that are exactly the right people, and to set myself up for the big change that I want to make in the coaching consulting world. And here's the big change. I don't think my agency is the be all end all answer, especially not to pay us $2,000 a month to produce your podcast for the end of time. That's right for a niche of time, and then something else needs to happen. And I'd struggle with what that thing was, but I figured what it was. The answer is every one of us who teaches and trains and leads people needs to have an ally, and that ally needs to be someone like an assistant who produces our podcast, pitches us and gets us featured, like does that kind of the behind the scenes work of splitting stuff up into social media content, like all those $15 an activities that we shouldn't be doing. The bottom line is if you pay an agency to do it, that you're going to get billed out a multiple of what that actually costs, because that's what it takes to run an agency, right? If they pay somebody $15 an hour on their team, you're paying $15 an hour or $50 an hour to get it done. That's just the reality of the economics. So the answer is everybody needs a person who reports to them who does all that stuff for you. So that's the change that I want to make. And so I've got an internship program within my agency right now that's training people up to eventually be that person. So I'm going to have people being raised up by working with my agency and by taking our courses. They're going to be like virtual assistants, or maybe even like assistants here in the States, that I can say to my client, hey, we launched your podcast 12 months ago. It's time to bring it in-house. And by the way, I have 5 people who are already trained to take it over. Let's start interviewing them and let's find the right one for you and let's turn it over. And then we go and we work with the next person who needs to get their podcast launched, because that's the place where I can be the most valuable. It's where the most profit is for me, and it's the right thing to do for the client. So the right thing to do for the client is let's launch it, let's get the strategy right. But once it's up on the ground, and the wheels are turning, we just need somebody to keep the trains running on time. That should be a $15 an hour person that reports to you. So that's the big change for me that I want to make.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I love it. We're going to have, let's see, we have 10 more minutes, and I actually have 3 questions that I picked out from my students. So I wanted to ask you a couple of things. Hold on. I got to get the notes. There they are. What do you think is the future of podcasting? Because it hasn't changed much.
Really hasn't. I think the name will go away, but the need for it will not. So I think for coaches and consultants and professional services and things like that, I don't see there ever being a time where people don't want to spend time with us consuming our content before they hand over thousands of dollars to work with us. So I think there will come a time when podcasting, it just doesn't magically attract new listeners because the market may be more saturated or whatever, although I think we have a ways to go before that. But if you're running a podcast to find your ideal clients, I don't think that need will ever go away. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next question is, if you are a social media podcast host to a certain group, and then you want to change groups, do you start a new podcast? So I guess that's a niche. So let's pretend, I don't know what niche they are, but they were a realtor niche, and now they're going to go over construction workers. Do they change the podcast, or do they just talk differently on the podcast?
I would say you've got a lot of flexibility. I would say I would say do everything you can to just gradually move the brand of the podcast over the course of a few months from old to new, and keep the podcast feed and the audience the same.
Okay.
Or, like
and
in the
then
sense
the people
that
for some reason they no longer like it, they just drop off, but at least you have a good start, so you don't have to start from scratch.
Yeah, because if you're talking about social media, there's probably going to be a lot of commonalities, and you can shift a lot and give yourself a lot of flexibility without having to start a completely different show.
Okay. All right, next question. Actually, I lied. There's 4. Sorry, I got an email right now while we were talking. Apple Podcasts says that if you have 10 episodes in 10 days, you will rank higher. Is that true?
I don't think so. Apple seems to be rewarding one thing, which is the number of new subscribers in a 72-hour period. Now, if you releasing 10 episodes is part of
Hold on.
some...
At the beginning or
Just
anytime at
anytime.
72 hours?
Yeah, just anytime. I mean, obviously the beginning helps to get like a new and noteworthy, but yeah, just anytime will affect your chart position. So yeah, they used to reward a lot of stuff, and it seems to keep shrinking until the only thing we can tell that really is predictable is getting new people to subscribe. And even just getting 100 new subscribers in a short window of time is enough to a lot of times put you in the top of the charts for your category. And so the only role that I can see for releasing a bunch of episodes at one time is not about the episodes. It's about whether that's part of your overall marketing push that gets a whole bunch of people to go check out the show and subscribe all at once. That's the only definition of what would make it a success.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
know?
All right. Last question. I want to change the name of my podcast. Will that hurt my downloads?
That is tactically, no. Tactically,
Okay.
it just keeps right on going. Like if they're subscribed, they're subscribed. You can literally upload new graphics and a new title to iTunes, and as long as iTunes approves it, you're good to go. Strategically, like that's a marketing question, right? Do you lose the subscribers? Well, it depends on the new name of the show, but it's not a technical problem. It's a marketing problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So Matt, if people want to reach out to you, connect with you, where could they find you?
So easiest place, which just has my social links and stuff like that, is getmicrofamous.com. If you want to go out and get pitched and featured on podcasts consistently, I've got a class on exactly how to do that, which includes like how to really craft a story hook that gets podcast hosts to say yes to you, which is the really hard part of getting pitched, right? That's the most important part. So if you go to howtogetfeatured.com, you can grab that class, that master class. I actually did it with my client, Dana Malstaff, who runs Boss Mom. She's the one that had that one podcast interview that generated her 6 figures in revenue. And we break down exactly how to craft your story hook that you put into your pitch email that goes out, whether you pitch yourself or whether somebody else does the pitching for you, doesn't matter. That'll give you the story hook. So that's at howtogetfeatured.com. And then, yeah, just pursuingresults.com for the podcast production service. So if you're curious about launching a new podcast from scratch, that's what we do. That's our bread and butter. So you can check us out there.
Yeah. And I'll put all the links in the show notes as well. And then when does your book come out? When can we buy that?
We're probably looking 4 to 6 weeks. So probably first 2 weeks of February. Yeah.
And is it a book or is it an Audible book or a hardcover or?
That's my proof copy right here. So we're going to start by just selling it through my own funnel. We'll do the Amazon bestseller thing. So there'll be a couple places people can get it. But yeah, if they go to how to get featured and sign up for the class, they'll be in the email list and they'll get notified when the book comes out. That's the best way to stay on top of that.
All right.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add before I close this down?
Other than the fact that it's been a lot of fun. I like talking to other marketing people because we can really get into fun, interesting conversations. So I really appreciate it. That's about all I have.
Yeah, I didn't really geek out that much on you, so you're lucky.
I feel like we could, we could have definitely gone more geeky.
We'll have to do it next time.
That's right.
All right, Matt, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and I cannot wait to read your book.
Thanks so much.
All right, bye.